We is entering its most critical corner, and you can help us out by subscribing to our new. The stress caused by the war has reached its breaking point because the tension line has increased more than it ever has before, and the tension in the region is boiling. The seemingly quiet front. In particular, we can now see an offensive operation breaking out in one region. This is because the tension line has risen higher than it ever has before. The Zapper, Easier, and Bakhmut are now the primary topics of discuss. The Crimean operation that the Ukrainians are getting ready for is seen as the primary cause of the tension on the southern front. The Ukrainian armed forces are planning a strong offensive through Melitopol, accumulating a serious force in Zaporizhzhia. In addition to this, Novakova intends to release the Ukrainian armed forces, which will then make an unexpected advance throughout the region where, on the southern arc of the tension line, the Ukrainian army is making significant preparations. Where do the primary scenes of the conflict come from? Akhman. Even though the Russian army continued to attack, the Ukrainian armed forces managed to repel the majority of these attacks, which is one of the primary reasons why Bakhmut is now in the spotlight. The desire of Russian President Vladimir Putin for Bakhmut to be completely under Russian control is one of the main reasons why Bakhmut is now in the spotlight. They were dealt severe defeats, and new twists of fate began to be played out by the Russian army in the front lines, according to the most recent report. In addition to the Ukrainian traps that suddenly appeared in unexpected areas, the operation in which nearly 5,000 Chechen fighters participated involved. And to add insult to injury, the right flank of the Ukrainian army that had surrounded the Russian army was captured by the Ukrainians. 5 battalions of Chechen fighters are currently engaged in combat alongside members of the Ukrainian armed forces. Eve was the one who established the 5th Chechen Battalion, which was added alongside the 4 Chechen battalions of fighters who had previously served in the Ukrainian ranks for a significant amount of time. Approximately 1,000 combatants make up each of the Libertarian Chechen battalions of its Kuria serving in the Ukrainian army. There is a significant amount of combat experience among the Chechen battalion's fighter, training on par with that of the Special Operations forces around the world that are considered to have the best training, together with the UF Regiment and the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces. These 5,000 warriors are pursuing the Russian forces in the Luhansk region, while also working toward the goal of inflicting as much damage on Putin as they possibly can. They are the primary support for both the defensive and offensive positions in the Don. Especially during this past week, the Russians were made aware of the presence of Ukrainian Chechens and UFs in positions of power. They are in pursuit of chase and hunt Russian troops under any and all circumstances, and in any and all locations, because they are familiar with every tactic, strategy, and logistical basis utilized by the Russians, and because they're able to think in the same. The Chechen people have already suffered through a tragedy similar to this one, and they are prepared to give their lives to protect the Ukrainian people from going through it. The battalion that was formed to eradicate the Russian presence in Bakhmut and alter the trajectory of the war immediately began carrying out its missions without pausing for any period of time. In addition, there is a volunteer battalion that bears the name of Sheikh Man. This battalion has been fighting the invaders since 2014. This battalion is currently performing the social and political movement known as Free Caucasus was established in 2006, and together with its recently established warrior brothers, it was the driving force behind the formation of the battalion that would later be named after Sheikh Mansour. This battalion was the second one after the battalion that had been formed, who had proven himself to be effective and received the approval and support of the Ukrainian authorities, led the battalion. We would like to bring to your attention the fact that the Chechen Republic of Kuria is a state institution that has self-proclaimed its existence following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But before that, we have to bring our attention back to the front because we have to scrutinize the situation in greater the reasons behind the recently observed uptick in interest in Bakhmut. In a video message that was sent out late yesterday evening, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that the country's most pressing concern right now is defending Bakhmut as Russian forces are making increasing gains around the city. However, Ukrainian forces have not yet withdrawn, which has resulted in a standoff in other eastern cities, similar to the situation that existed in several Donets last year and is reminiscent of drawn-out battles. The telegram referred to the ground forces of the Ukrainian government, the tunnel through which the adversary is attempting to break through the defenses, as well as the retaking of, and the fact that they are commanded by the Eastern Ukrainian Military Group Commander Colonel General Alexander Cky made a trip to the defense unit stationed in Ukraine. Russia is currently attempting to besiege Bakhmut, and it appears that they are using the best troops that Wagner has to offer, troops that are both the most experienced and the most. The Ukrainian military will obviously consider all of their options. After all, they have been providing assistance to the city up until this point. However, should it become necessary, they will retreat strategically because doing so could lure the Russians into a wolf trap. They did this many times throughout the war to avoid needless civilian casualties. Currently, there are approximately 4,500 civilians still in Bakhmut as Russian forces continue to advance towards the city. A spokesperson for the Donetsk Regional Military Administration in Ukraine named Tatiana Ignatenko stated that she urged people to evacuate the city because of the danger, but she also stated that they had sufficient. We are aware that the Ukrainian armed forces have approached this matter with a high level of sensitivity ever since the conflict began. However, it is abundantly clear that the Russian army does not pay a significant amount of attention to civilian settlements, and the Russians also use civilians as an excuse to threaten. If we look at what Bakhmut means for the upcoming days of the war, a soldier from the 93rd Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces says that his country's forces are still in the backward position and that there are no plans to withdraw. A much more distinct picture will present itself to us. Since the summer of last year, the city has been within a stone's throw of the front. It is situated in the northeast of the Donetsk region, approximately 20 kilometers, 13 miles from Luhansk. Russian forces have been targeting the city for several months. Therefore, the conquest of it by Moscow's forces would constitute a long-awaited victory for them and would bring some limited strategic value. There are significant road links that connect Bakhmut to other areas of the Doners because of its location on the border with Luhansk in the east, SLO in the northwest, and costly Anton in the southwest. The city served as an important crossing point for a number of weeks instead of leading directly to the city center. The roads leading to Badu gradually came under the control of Russian forces. VA factions made a concerted effort to evacuate the city in a wide arc, beginning in January. They took control of the nearby town of Solider, and since then they have taken control of a number of hamlets and villages to the north of Baghdad. However, in some circumstances such as the incident, these villages and hamlets can become graves for the people who live there. What we just went over is what will happen if the Russians give up the highlands to the west of the. It is not clear exactly where the Ukrainian forces will retreat if they withdraw from the city, but taking Bakhmut is a good bet. The nearby industrial towns of costly Anika and Kramatorsk will be at the mercy of artillery and even longer-range mortars, and it is not clear where the Ukrainian forces will take Bakhmut. It is highly unlikely that this will result in a significant shift in the overall picture of the war in eastern Ukraine, where very little territory has changed hands in 2023. An offensive that lasted for so long and cost so much was necessary in order to capture such a small city. This demonstrates that the Russian army's presence in the region is woefully inadequate. However, Putin's unyielding stance on this matter remains unchanged. So what exactly is the motivation behind this obstinacy? Let's have a brief discussion about this topic, because despite the fact that the significance of Bakhmut as a strategic asset cannot be overstated, capturing it could still have a very welcome symbolic impact. After Russian forces captured the town of Sor in the middle of January, this had an effect on Russian President Vladimir. It marked the first gain in the Donbass region in several months after a period of 6 weeks. The successful capture of Bakhmut would mark the completion of the subsequent Step Wagner Group and is frequently critical of the Special Military Operations Administration of the Russian Defense Ministry in Ukraine, Wagner warriors. He is also in an important position for the oligarchy of Guinea PR. Prin is the leader of the Wagner. Heavy casualties were sustained on the ground by the group, many of whom were formerly incarcerated individuals, which transformed into a battlefield of mud and trenches, reminiscent of the First World War. After months of the Russian Ministry of Defense doing nothing but retreating, Ferguson scrambles to show that his men can surrender with the capture of Salada and now backward. However, present questions will remain for Putin, even if his forces successfully launched an attack on Bakhmut. In order to compensate for the devastating casualties that his war has inflicted on the Russian military, Vladimir Putin has already been forced to make difficult and less than ideal decisions. The specter of unlimited human power in Russia is a myth. If he continues to be adamant about using force of some kind to impose his will on Ukraine in 2023, he will be confronted with choices just as challenging as those he is currently. It is possible for Russia to muster additional manpower, and it is likely that Vladimir Putin will do so rather than give up. However, the price tag that Putin and Russia will have to pay for any actions that are taken at this point will begin to skyrocket almost immediately. In the event that this imposition by Putin leads to the loss of Pri's Wagners, one can hear the Kremlin crackling with discontent, even though it was not what he wanted to. The leader of Russia gave Ferguson significant political power. Even though the Wagner Group sustained significant casualties in the Donbass region, He is not going to contradict him because he does not want to. It retains a very significant level of military power. He is fully aware that the decision he made to enlist 300,000 Russian men will result in the dissolution of his own army in the event that this military force chooses to support. Putin took a significant risk and instigated widespread unrest among his country's population. On the other hand, he is completely oblivious to this turbulent environment for the time being. However, Putin's defeat in Ukraine appears to be of much greater significance than the uprisings that he was able to put down from Moscow. However, when the growing number of Chechen rebels and the precarious state of the Russian army are factored into the equation, the work becomes significantly more difficult. With just one misstep in 2023, Russia will be dragged down the slippery slope to its own destruction. In the following days, we will have a much clearer picture of the outcomes of these analyses. But Putin is aware that this is the case unless he takes some drastic. He is doomed, and the only person who can pose a threat to the King of Ukraine is his Vir. Please ensure that you have subscribed to our channel and that you have notifications turned on so that you are notified when we upload new videos. Our knowledgeable team takes great care in preparing our content for you. This content can only be found on the Ultimate channel for Ukraine On. We will pursue legal action against any and all channels, social media platforms, and websites that make unauthorized use of our content. We appreciate you keeping an eye on us. Vladimir Putin blamed the policies of the West for Russia's claims that it had attacked Ukrainian territory, and he launched an unjust, unprovoked war against Ukraine in clear violation of international. Russia's claims that it had attacked Ukrainian territory were based on these policies. As a direct result of this extensive invasion attempt, which Russia referred to as a so-called special military operation, millions of people were subjected to the brutality and devastating consequences of the conflict. The conflict that broke out between Russia and Ukraine also took place during World War I. It is regarded as the most significant conflict that has taken place since World War II. In addition, during this war, the Russian army, which is consistently ranked as one of the top 3 armies in the world in terms of power, suffered the worst defeats it had ever suffered in its entire existence. In a nutshell, we could say that Ukraine shocked the entire world with the presence of the Russian army, which is widely regarded as being unbeatable. In contrast to the forecast that was presented in the media prior to February 24th, the actual event occurred. The fall of Kiev did not take place in just 3 days. Even after a year of continuous fighting, the same people continue to hold the various leadership positions in Ukraine. As a result, the resolve shown by both the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian people to defend their country has won praise from people all over In the month of March, the Russian invaders got within 25 kilometers of the capital city of Kiev, which is equivalent to 25% of Ukraine. The Russian armed forces, on the other hand, at that time, lost a significant portion of the lands that they had seized in the first few days of the conflict. With the retaliatory attacks that the Ukrainian army launched in 2022, we can therefore say that Ukraine's momentum in the conflict started to pick up. At this point, yes, I am grateful for this. The odds of Ukraine coming out on top against Russia were improving rapidly. One of the most popular destinations in Russia is the city of Volador, which is located in the Donetsk region of. In this decisive battle, Ukraine was involved. The fighting in the city of Valor, which is located in the Donetsk region of Ukraine, is going at full speed despite the fact that Russian forces are attempting to enter the city from the south of the front lines. Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, issued a statement in which he announced that Russian forces had caused extraordinary casualties specifically referring to the town in the vicinity of which fighting has become more intense over the past few months. Zelensky emphasized that the greater the number of casualties, the more Russia comes up short. The sooner it can put an end to the war, the better. Located 144 kilometers to the southwest of Bakhmut, the small coal mining town of Olir can be found in the eastern Donetsk region of. Russian forces see these cities means they use them in eastern Ukraine to gain access to the nearby main rail link connecting southern Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula. The outnumbered Russian forces are still driving their vehicles into the minefield in these 2 cities. These cities are what they use in eastern Ukraine to gain access to the nearby main rail link connecting southern Ukraine and the Chionpi. In spite of the larger number of casualties, the Russians' objective in these cities is to break through the Ukrainian defense line by attacking non-stop regardless of the number of lives that are lost in the process. The city of Olir, which is located in the area where the voices of the clashes can be heard, has become a ghost. In the same manner as other settlements located along the front line, the remaining people are fighting for their lives despite the constant bombardment coming from the Russians, which occurs both day and night. On the other hand, the members of the Ukrainian army who are responsible for the defense of the city have made up their minds that they will not retreat. The valiant Ukrainian forces who refuse to give up are continuing to be success. On the other hand, we repelled the attacks that the Russian invaders were making on us, and we repelled the attacks that Russia was making in this direction. Ukraine has released new images that were taken at the epicenter of the fighting during a battle that lasted 3 weeks for control of the eastern coal mining town of Olir. The Ukrainian army claimed that they were able to destroy at least 130 Russian. According to experts, this war featured the largest tank battle in history, and it was a humbling defeat for Vladimir Putin. 3 weeks' worth of footage shows a column of Russian tanks being ambushed by Ukrainian soldiers hiding in the nearby woods, and the footage also shows the Russian tanks trying to retreat in order to get away from the Ukrainians. They detonate simultaneously with the lethal mines that Ukraine has been planting in the surrounding. The fact that the Russians have suffered such heavy casualties is something that should be obvious. The Ukrainian government constructed a road junction in the Donbas region that turned out to be a peculiar death trap for Russian forces. The Ukrainian army, armed with rockets and anti-tank missiles, mined the intersection and defended it with the missiles. Due to the fact that Ukrainian soldiers and drones are present in the area, the Russians are experiencing hard losses that will be remembered throughout the annals of history here, because this is such a well-known killing ground. It is even making headlines on various social media platforms. However, despite this, the Russians continue to attempt to cross the intersection after being ambushed for several weeks. During the course of a prolonged conflict that lasted for 3 weeks, Russian forces deployed dozens of tank columns in an area close to Olir. In an effort to break through the Ukrainian lines, the junction is now littered with the shattered remains of the tanks and other combat vehicles that were destroyed during the conflict. After the Russians had already suffered the loss of this elite brig, the Ukrainian armed forces claimed in February that they had destroyed almost an entire brigade of Russia's 155th Marines in Valor. This claim came after the Russians had already been defeated by the Ukrainians. I was responsible for the near-total collapse of the leadership in Moscow. The Russian crew kept driving their tanks and other war vehicles to the deadly intersection on the Olir Road, and they kept getting blown up by mines and missiles as they did. The Russians stationed in Valador were unprepared for the ambush tactics used by the Ukrainians due to their lack of experience in combat. They utilized it throughout the duration of the occupation. The Russian tanks were forced to flow down the track as the Ukrainian mined 2 fields through which a safe dirt road ramp was located. This occurred as the Russian tanks approached the end of the Ukrainians were able to conceal the anti-tank teams that were armed with American weapons. Javelins with infrared guidance and Ukrainian Stigna P missiles with laser guidance were placed behind the tree line. The Ukrainian brigade opened fire on the Russian column, which resulted in the Russians being frantically forced to retreat and turn around. The Russian tanks had no choice but to return to the minefields, which caused the vehicles to. The inflated tanks then acted as a barrier, slowing and stalling the column. At this point, Ukrainian artillery opened fire, which blew up more Russian battleships, and the Russian soldiers descending from the disabled machines were neutralized. As a consequence of this, the Russian military suffered a loss of at least 130 tanks and armored personnel carriers during the conflict, as reported by the Ukrainian. On the other hand, Russian President Vladimir Putin was soundly defeated at Olir, which was an extremely embarrassing outcome. Russia, which was incapable of absorbing such a significant defeat. On the other hand, faced with the rapidly deepening recession due to Western sanctions, it provides clear evidence that Western sanctions, while specifically targeting the oil and gas, are putting increasing pressure on the country's trade dynamics and on the finances of the Russian government. It appears that the tipping point will be reached in 2023, and additional actions taken by Ukraine's allies could make Russia's vulnerabilities even more exposed, which would hasten the victory. We are able to see that the overall macroeconomic picture has become more negative in every location as a direct consequence of the narrowing of Russia's trade. Sir, the widening budget deficit, the pressure on the ruble, which is under pressure, and the increasing pressure in multiple dimensions all contribute to the overall situation. He is under the impression that he's keeping something from everyone, the true extent of the damage that war and sanctions have caused to the Russian economy. Most importantly, there is a considerably less encouraging atmosphere external. This year, they will no longer be able to compensate for the weak domestic demand, which will result in a contraction of between 5 and 6% according to our baseline scenario, and a larger drop if sanctions are tightened. After all, the war causes the people of Russia to have lower real wages and incomes, which is supported by official data showing that Russia is experiencing economic decline, but the actual impact is probably going to be much. Additionally, Export controls implemented by Ukraine's coalition partners have had a discernible impact on Russia's capacity to manufacture military hardware. In fact, we can say that these effects brought about the total anarchy that existed in Russia as a result of the war. Since Russia is unable to achieve its OB objectives in Ukraine, it is eager to bring an end to the conflict as soon as, and in light of this as a direct consequence of a large-scale attack that will take place during the spring month, the Russians intend to gather an army of 200,000 people in order to coerce Ukraine into accepting peace terms. The situation in Russia is currently at its most hopeless and yet remains stuck in a stalemate. It does not matter what he does because it will not improve his. This means that disorder will spread across the battlefield as well as throughout Russia itself. It is fair to say that Vladimir Putin, the current president of Russia, has led his country down a path that will not end well in the 21st century. To ensure that you are kept up to date regarding new videos uploaded by Paladin Ukraine, please ensure that you have subscribed to our channel and that notifications are turned. We prepare the most up-to-date and striking news, the fullest, the most satisfying, collective, and accurate information from reliable official sources, OB objectively with the comments of our knowledgeable staff, and we strive to deliver them to you as quickly as possible. With our original licensed content voices and professional narrator staff, our content is meticulously crafted by our experienced team and it is exclusive to the Paladin Ukraine YouTube. We will pursue legal action against any channels, social media, platforms, or websites that use our content without our permission. We appreciate you keeping an eye on us. A significant blow is dealt by the Ukrainian army to Russian forces in the region of Zyzia, which has been occupied for a long time. Not able to put up a fight, the armed forces of the Zyzia region demanded that Russian forces withdraw from the area. Zyzia, which was one of the first regions in Ukraine to be occupied by the Russian army, is the location of the largest nuclear power plant in all of Europe. This nuclear power plant, Andrea, is one of the largest power generation facilities in all of facilities. Vladimir Putin, who had the intention of causing harm to Ukraine, infrastructure relating to electricity aimed to deliver a significant blow. The Ukraine took control of the Zyzia nuclear power plant shortly before invading the Zyzia region. This was accomplished by seizing the nuclear, following the recent escalation of attacks by the Russian military on nuclear energy infrastructure. Russian forces fired Ukrainian citizens working at the plant and replaced them with engineers brought in from Russia. This action was taken in response to the situation in Ukraine. Vladimir Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine, ordered the beginning of an operation to seize the nuclear facility located in Zap. Well, Vladimir Putin was so confident that the Ukrainian army would not attack the nuclear power plant that he converted it into a nomination depot instead. After it became known that the nuclear facility was being used as a storage facility, Russian soldiers began using it as a warehouse to store their ammunition and weapons. This continued until it was discovered that the nuclear facility was being used as a storage facility. The United States and other Western nations issued a warning to Vladimir Putin to leave the area immediately because an explosion at this facility could result in a catastrophic event. According to the reports, there would be a second explosion in the vault in the event that there was an explosion at this facility. Our very own Chernobyl catastrophe. Vladimir Putin, true to form, did not take anyone's advice and kept employing the building as a military ammunition depot, despite their protest. Zelensky, who did not wish for Zaporizhzhia to continue to be governed by the Russians, initiated the operation that had been planned for Zaporizhzhia as part of the operation. The Russian forces that are occupying Ukraine have for a long time been conducting airstrikes against the city of Hun Nero in an effort to weaken the power held by the Ukrainian army in this region, along with a contingent of 5,000 Ukrainian soldiers. More than 50 armored vehicles and battle tanks have been sent to Dnipro by the Ukrainian army. Additionally, the city of Dina Nitro has begun to see the arrival of Ukrainian soldiers. Although Russian forces pretended that this military buildup was for the purpose of protecting the city, it was actually part of a covert operation that was being conducted by the Ukrainian army, and the Ukrainian army had already begun the operation with the intention of freeing this area of occupied territory from the Russian forces that were controlling it. The Ukrainian army, numbering 5,000 strong, was organized on the banks of the Dpa River, and they immediately began moving in the direction of Zyzia. The Ukrainian army, whose primary OB objective was to free the occupied towns of Zyzia, moved into the city of Myviva, which is located in that region. Following the arrival of the Ukrainian armed forces in the town, attacks were carried out by Russian forces occupying Ukraine against the Ukrainian armed forces using unmanned war. Ukrainian troops carrying out a strategic plan started organizing airstrikes against Russian troops stationed in the city. These strikes were directed against the Russian troops in order to better protect themselves from these airstrikes. The Russian soldiers that had been hiding in abandoned buildings began to leave those buildings. Tanks from Ukraine surrounded the city, preventing Russian soldiers from escaping through the cities. Russian soldiers were cornered inside the city as a result of artillery fire from Ukrainian forces, which bombarded the city. According to the Ukrainian army, a Russian unit consisting of 300 individuals was destroyed as a result of this operation. Through the use of the Telegram channel, they organized themselves. It was also stated that a large number of Russian soldiers abandoned their posts and fled. The Ukrainian army was able to enter and take control of the city of Myviva after a successful military operation. Utilizing this operation that was planned and executed by the Ukrainian army, the initial move toward the liberation of Zyzia was made because of one's job. Zaporizhzhia was the next city on the agenda for the Ukrainian army after they had recently achieved their goal of freeing the city of Myviva from Russian occupant. Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, issued a red alert and called an emergency meeting after his country's military was unable to prevent the capture of the city of Mount Pk by the Ukrainian army. During this meeting, that took place very late at night, it was mentioned in the morning as Russian troops started to move from Melitopol and Berden. It was decided to send Russian troops into Ukrainian territory to the EO. This decision was made as the Russian troops were moving on the way to the brazier. It became clear that the decision had been made very thoughtfully. After all, Vladimir Putin began moving the Russian troops stationed in the regions that are close to Zyzia closer and closer to the city itself. The Russian army, numbering 6,000 strong, commenced its advance toward Paris, accompanied by a significant number of tanks and armored vehicles. However, the Ukrainian army had already left Majusa and entered Neka, which is located very close to the center of Zyzia. A large number of Russian troops are stationed in the city, and there are vanguard forces of the Russian army present as well. In the battle for Naka, Ukrainian forces were successful in driving back Russian forces. After hours of fighting, Russian troops in the city allegedly received orders to withdraw, but they still started to leave the city without putting up much of a fight against the Ukrainian army. Regarding this matter, we do not have access to very clear information. The Chief of Staff for Russia, Eric Y. Osmo, appears to be making an effort to pull back the Russian troops stationed in the towns, bordering support more easily and gather them. If the Ukrainian army is able to maintain their position, you get 1 point. These towns have been freed. It has the intention of deploying. Given the presence of HIMARS missile systems in these towns, any attempt to attack Zaporizhzhia via land at this time would be suicidal. As a consequence of this, it intends to launch HIMARS missile. Following the successful operation carried out by the Ukrainian army in these two captured cities, the Ukrainian Air Force will conduct airstrikes on the military headquarters in Zyzia. Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky made statements addressing Vladimir Putin. Zelensky stated that the Russian troops stationed in the Zyzia region still have a chance to withdraw, and that the Ukrainian army will not give up on this attack, stating that they have the coordinates of all of the Russian headquarters in Zyzia. He also stated that the Ukrainian army will not give up on this attack because they have the coordinates of all of the Russian headquarters in Zaporizhzhia in an attempt to intimidate Vladimir. Zelensky declared that there are no roadblocks preventing the Ukrainian army from launching an airstrike. Following this statement, Vladimir Zelensky issued an order for the cities of Myviva and Natalija to be armed with HIMARS missiles that had been purchased from the United States ever since the conflict first broke out. In each of his speeches, Zelensky has offered Russian troops stationed on Ukrainian soil a chance to. Zelensky issues a call to action to Russian soldiers, telling them that they do not have to sacrifice anyone else for Putin and that they can surrender to the Ukrainian army. Following the completion of these operations that were organized by the Ukrainian army, the Russian armed forces will require a significant increase in the quantity of weapons and perhaps as a direct consequence of the operation that the Ukrainian army just carried out, the Zyzia nuclear facility stockpile of munitions will undergo decommissioning so that they can be recycled. In the event that Zyzia's ammunition supplies are removed within this region, the Ukrainian army is able to easily organize its various operat. To prevent a Mojo catastrophe from occurring, the Ukrainian army is currently not even attacking in the vicinity of this nuclear facility. Nevertheless, prior to the invasion of Zyzia by Russian forces, they were engaging in reckless attacks on areas that were in close proximity to this nuclear facility. A nuclear facility was the target of airstrikes carried out by the Russian army prior to their invasion of Zaporizhzhia. This was done in order to drive the withdrawal of the Ukrainian army from the area. If the nuclear reactor had been struck by the Russian military attack, a catastrophic event would have been the likely outcome. However, one of the artillery shells fired by the Russian army did hit the Zaporizhzhia nuclear facility, which resulted in a massive fire. Since the beginning of the conflict, the leader of the Ukrainian government, Zelensky, has been outspoken in his condemnation of the atrocities committed by the Russian army in Zaporizhzhia. Putin, whose attacks on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear facility put the lives of everyone in Europe in jeopardy, is currently being tried in international courts for his role in launching these attacks. Zelensky filed a lawsuit against Putin by presenting his evidence to the international courts in Minsk. Vladimir Putin will be tried at the end of the war, and experts say that if this happens, Vladimir Putin's regime will end. According to election polls conducted by independent polling companies in Russia, Putin has not even lost more than 20% of the vote since the beginning of the war. At the end of the war, Vladimir Putin will be tried in many cases, and experts say that if this warrants it, Vladimir Putin's regime will. Even if Vladimir Putin is not removed from power by a military coup, he will undoubtedly come out on the losing end of the next election.